So have you ever heard this idea that deep inside your skull, there's a primitive lizard brain that's driving all your basic urges? For food, for fighting. It's probably one of the most popular ideas in all of pop neuroscience. The only problem? It's completely wrong. So today, let's dive into the real story of how our brains evolved, which, believe me, is way more fascinating than the myth.
But first, we really have to ask a super basic question. Why even have a brain in the first place? I mean, seriously, think about it. For us humans, it takes nearly 2 decades to fully grow, its size makes childbirth pretty dangerous, and this thing, right now, is gobbling up a huge chunk of your body's energy. So, what is the massive payoff for this huge, expensive, and fragile organ?
Well, this quote right here sets up the answer perfectly, and it comes from one of the strangest stories in all of biology, about an animal that actually eats its own brain once it decides it's time to settle down for good. Okay, meet the humble sea squirt. It starts its life looking kind of like a tadpole, swimming around freely in the ocean, and at this stage it has a simple brain. Its one and only goal is to find a nice, safe spot on the seafloor to plant itself for the rest of its life. And once it finds that perfect real estate, the very first thing it does is digest its own brain and nervous system. Why? It just doesn't need it anymore.
So what's the lesson here? It's actually incredibly simple but profound. Brains are fundamentally tied to movement. The sea squirt tells us that the main job of a brain isn't really for deep thoughts or complex feelings, but to help an animal navigate a tricky, changing world. If you stop moving, the brain pretty much becomes a useless luxury that costs way too much energy to maintain.
And this simple idea leads us to a really powerful new way of thinking about what brains are actually for. They didn't just evolve for moving around. They evolved to solve one very, very specific problem: finding stuff you need to survive when that stuff is scattered all over the place.
So, in this view, the brain is, at its core, a foraging device. But the absolute key word here is predict. See, it's not enough to just react to food when you accidentally bump into it. To be a successful forager, you need to anticipate, you need to predict where the good stuff is going to be and figure out the most efficient way to get it.
And you know who's an absolute master at this? The humblebee. A bee is a world-class forager. It doesn't just fly around randomly hoping to find a flower. Nope. It learns which colors, which shapes, and which locations predict a sweet, sugary reward. And the secret sauce for how it learns is this amazing chemical trick in its tiny brain that involves dopamine. So check out how this teaching signal actually works. At first, the bee gets a little spike of dopamine, that, hey, that's good signal, only when it gets the actual nectar. But after a few successful trips, its brain learns. The signal literally shifts in time. Now the dopamine spike happens when the bee just sees the flower. The reward isn't the nectar anymore. The reward is predicting the nectar correctly. And what if the flower is empty? The dopamine level actually dips below baseline, sending a clear signal. Whoa, that was worse than I expected. This is prediction in action.
Okay, so brains are predictive foraging devices. Got it. But to really understand our own brain, the unique mammalian brain, and to finally bust that lizard brain myth, we need to take a trip way back in time. Because the story of our brain was literally forged in the fires of our planet's greatest disasters.
All right, let's run through millions of years of history really fast. Our story starts over 300 million years ago, when our ancestors split off from the reptile line. But then, boom, 2 massive extinction events hit the planet. The first one, called the Great Dying, was catastrophic, and in the aftermath, reptiles, specifically the dinosaurs, took over the whole world. This forced our ancestors into the shadows, literally. They became these small, nocturnal, insect-eating creatures. It was a tough life, for sure, but that pressure, that niche, was the key to our survival and to the evolution of our secret weapon. Think about it. Living in the dark, hunting by sound and smell, trying not to get eaten, that requires a totally new kind of brain, one that's incredibly flexible, super adaptable, and can make sense of all this complex sensory information. And this intense evolutionary pressure led to the single greatest innovation in the history of the mammalian brain, the neocortex. Just take a look at the difference here. On one side, you have a reptile brain, and on the other, an early mammal brain. The shrew's brain is just dominated by that big, wrinkly structure covering the top. That's the neocortex. Now, it looks like a brand new part that just got plopped on top, right? But the real story, it's so much cooler than that.
So what even is this neocortex? The easiest way to think about it is like a powerful, flexible sheet of computer chips wrapped around the brain.
It's organized into these 6 distinct layers that allow for incredibly complex calculations. And here's the best part. It's modular. It's made of repeating columns. So if evolution needed to upgrade the brain, it didn't have to redesign the whole thing. It could just add more columns, making it bigger and way more powerful.
And this right here brings us back full circle to that big myth, the idea of the triune brain. You know, a rational human brain on top of an emotional mammal brain on top of a primitive lizard brain. It's a simple story, it's easy to remember, and it is totally, completely wrong. Let's finally put this idea to rest.
Okay, so here it is. This is the crucial piece of the puzzle that just shatters the myth. The myth says we have a lizard brain tucked inside our modern one. But the reality, based on modern genetics and neuroscience, is that the parts are homologous. That means the part of a reptile's brain called the dorsal cortex and our own massive neocortex actually evolved from the very same structure in a common ancestor.
And that is the big takeaway. Evolution doesn't work like Legos, just snapping new, better parts on top of old ones. Instead, it tinkers. It took a structure that our common ancestor with reptiles already had and gave it a massive, radical upgrade, expanding it, reorganizing it into the 6-layered powerhouse that is our neocortex. So you don't have a lizard brain. You have a souped-up, remixed, supercharged version of a brain part that lizards also have.
And what's just incredible about this neocortex is how flexible it is. It is not a fixed, hardwired machine that you're born with. It's what you might call a magnificent compromise. It's constantly being shaped and molded by your genes, your environment, and every single thing you learn and experience.
Which really leaves us with a final and I think a really powerful thought. This grand story of evolution, it didn't just stop millions of years ago. It's happening inside your skull right now. Your brain is a product of this incredible, deep history, but it is also wonderfully, remarkably adaptable. So knowing that, what are you going to build with yours?